With the drastically rising prices of construction materials, like you just heard Vanessa talking about, due to issues with the supply chain, are these homes more trouble than they're worth? One first-time buyer shared with CNN.
We didn't estimate enough wood for the first floor, and we went back to buy more wood for the flooring, and it ended up that after a month's time, the flooring went up about 25 cents per square foot.
According to Associated Builders and Constructors, iron and steel is up 50.3%. Asphalt, tar, and siding, 22.5%. Softwood lumber, roughly 22%. And these are just prices over a 12-month period. What if disruptors in the supply chain continue? Well, we've got someone here to help you. Financial expert Alexis Glick joins me now to figure it all out. Alexis, we'll get to the investment value of a fixer-upper in just a second. But first, I want to look at some numbers. According to Associated Builders and Contractors, iron and steel is up so high. And according to Redfin, the biggest obstacle preventing renters from buying a home is some form of debt. Whether it's student loans, whether it's medical, a car payment, whatever it is. So how the heck do you save for a home when you've got these other things? Should you be trying to pay that stuff off or really looking to save for the purchase of a home?
Well, I mean, as you raised, those are the key, those four factors that you just showed are the four factors that make it more and more difficult for folks to purchase a home. So you have a combination of debt. You spoke about a little bit earlier with Vanessa. It could be that you have debt from student loans. And that's one of the things that we've seen through COVID, right, is that the administration at the federal and the state level really allowed the best way to put it is to kick the can down the road, right? So they allowed people to stop paying either their student loans or there was some forbearance on their rent, right? They were getting all this assistance. Now some of those programs are starting to unwind depending on where you are in the country. We know the president just pushed the student loan timing to the end of August. But at the end of the day, if you have either student loans, some form of debt, housing prices rising at the same time, and oh, by the way, depending on how your credit situation is, and you just heard Vanessa talk about inflationary price pressures. I mean, right now, the average American who wants to purchase a home, they're spending 29% of their monthly income toward their monthly mortgage.
It's a third of their income, basically.
A third of their income. And so if you look at housing affordability, and if you look at the pricing environment right now, we're seeing some of the worst levels that we've seen in decades in terms of how much prices have increased in the last year alone.
It's scary when you think about it because it means you're kind of stuck and trying to figure out what to do. We know that prices for rent are also skyrocketing. So how do you save for a down payment if your rent is already crushing your finances?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at, you just heard Vanessa talk about the year-over-year rental prices. And yes, while they're in the mid-teens, in some areas of the country, in Austin, for example, 40% increase. In Miami, north of a 30% increase. So it depends on where you are in the country. It could be far worse. She even said in some cases you've seen doubles. So the key thing here is that, number one, when you're going to buy a home, there are a lot more costs associated with buying a home than meets the eye. Everyone talks about what the down payment is, but then you've got the mortgage, you have the insurance, you have moving costs. I mean,
closing
costs, like the list goes on and on, right? So if you're renting, you have to just make sure you're not renting over your skis, right? Because if your ultimate goal is to be a home buyer, you want to make sure that of your discretionary income, like we talked about, in some cases, people are spending a third of their income on their mortgage. Well, the difference there is that you own that property. And usually, on average, within 5 to 7 years, that home value will kind of come back to you in spades in 5 to 7 years of a 30-year mortgage. In a rent, you're just throwing that money away. So the key thing is to make sure you are not renting in an environment that is too much of your monthly disposable income.
So that you can start squirreling away bit by bit.
Put it away.
I will admit, I didn't buy, I was terrified of buying, and I didn't buy until well into my 40s. I don't care. You can know my age. That's fine. And for me, it was, I had to convince myself. And how I convinced myself was something you just said. I told myself, even if you sold this house for exactly what you paid, it's free rent. So think of it that way. Now, remote work has changed the game.
Yeah.
It's on the rise because of the pandemic. Companies are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, this works. How's that changed what people are looking for and fighting over now when it comes to housing?
It's changed it dramatically. So just to give you some context, prior to the pandemic, 80% of American workers live within a half hour of where they go to work every single day. We have seen 5 million people get up and move as a result of the ability to do remote work. The statistics argue that we may see as many as an additional 19 million people do the same thing. So what that means is that in certain areas of the marketplace, we've seen this, right? In all the warm weather climates, you've seen incredible moves down to Florida, Arizona, some of the warmer climates, right? But there are areas of the country where there is still an opportunity to purchase a home at a reasonable rate. Now, the median house, $350,000, is unthinkable. However, the only other thing I would just add to this is you're seeing this come out little by little. Tech companies, media companies, now banking companies starting to agree to a hybrid work environment. So that's going to allow more flexibility as to where people can afford and can choose to live across the country. And so we're going to see a continued shift and movement across the country because of a remote work environment.
Can you give people some advice? I'll take some too. I'd love some advice. Some advice on, how they can go towards buying a home, what they should be thinking about and looking at right now, and is it even a good time?
Well, first of all, the number one thing I would say is there are great mortgage calculators, right? The number one thing is there's FOMO, like Vanessa talked about, but then there's also this I'm falling in love with something I can't afford, and that's a no-no. So number one, use those mortgage calculators to help you understand what you can afford. Number two, prepare yourself. One of the biggest problems right now is that a lot of homes, in some cases, in some markets, 30, 40% of them are being sold in all cash offers. Right. Wall Street is buying real estate at record levels. So you're not just competing with another home buyer, you're now competing with investors. So the important thing is make sure you know what you can afford, number one. Number two, make sure that you're actually doing the work to understand what's your credit score. So because banks are going to assess and evaluate your credit. How well are you doing? Are you cleaning up any credit mistakes? Because at the end of the day, if you do need to finance it, you're going to be dependent on what a bank is willing to give you. So all of those steps in advance are super important. And the other thing is if you have flexibility, do the homework to evaluate where in the country you can really get affordable housing. Now is the time to investigate that.
That's interesting because you said if your company will let you live somewhere else and not come into the office every day, maybe it's better to go out into a rural area that you can afford a place to live. But then doesn't that push up the housing prices all around the city as well?
Well, it's interesting because as you heard Vanessa talk about, right, there was this move away from urbanization, right? We've been talking for decades about the urbanization movement, and it's gone in the opposite extreme, right? But think just for a second, the one thing I will tell you not to be afraid of is I work with CEOs every day. I advise some of the biggest CEOs in the world, and this is keeping them up at night, right? Because you have inflationary pressures that are hitting the economy, supply chain pressures, what you're spending year over year, whether it's the gas pump, your food, your housing, everything, right, is exploding. But if you're an employer, one of the things you're worried about is the markets in which you employ people. Is there affordable housing? So you may find that your employer is more willing to work with you than you would suspect because they too are concerned about how they can ensure that you can come to work and be able to maintain that wage. So there's more flexibility in those conversations with your employers today than you'd be surprised. And part of that is we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in American history.
They are looking for workers. So you're saying don't just negotiate salary and benefits, negotiate where you live, see if they've got a little extra money if you're trying to buy, because some companies do that as well, correct?
Absolutely, and they are willing to listen right now. There is a moment in time where, frankly, I don't know that we've seen this in our lifetime, where the worker, the employee, has more power than ever. And employers understand that. So don't be afraid to have that conversation, because that's part of why we've seen all these fits and starts about return to work, is now we recognize, if I can increase my productivity, if I can make my people happy, and they can live in another place where it is
where
more
I live?
exactly.
Right. That makes total sense.
Important conversation.
Alexis Glick, thank you so much for your very good advice and wonderful insight.
Thank you.